Hi, and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review for Star Trek Deep Space Nine Season 2. This video is a part of a series of videos where I review every episode of Star Trek Deep Space Nine, one season at a time. In this video, I cover all episodes of Season 2. So Season 2 was still rough and definitely one of the weaker seasons of the show, but it was definitely an improvement on Season 1. In fact, a lot of people like to compare the first two seasons of Deep Space Nine to that of the first two seasons of The Next Generation, and I suppose they are similar in the regard that they were the weakest two of their respective shows, and that the show is trying to find its footing. But I personally think it's unfair to compare the two because I don't think Season 2 of Deep Space Nine is anywhere near as weak as the first two seasons of The Next Generation, which I think were way worse. In fact, Season 2 of The Next Generation wasn't really an improvement on Season 1. In fact, in many ways it was worse than Season 1, whereas Deep Space Nine, Season 2 was definitely an improvement on Season 1. Although the show would definitely get better in later seasons, I still view Season 2 overall as a good season and a decent watch. I remember reading a TV Guide article shortly before Season 2 was released that was teasing Season 2, talking about all the improvements they made to make Season 2 better. First off, people complained Season 1 was too dark, and that Sisko was too dark and mean as a character, which probably had a lot to do with him being a dick to Picard in the pilot episode, and people love Picard, so how dare you be a dick to Picard? And it's funny because in the pilot episode of Season 2, or the premiere episode of Season 2, I think they overcompensate for this, as Sisko's overly friendly and bright, as when Jake asks him if he has him, and he's like, "Hey, for you, always." And when Kira goes to ask him for a runabout, he's like, "Hey, Kira, how are you? Come have lunch. Oh, you want a runabout? What a doozy." And they did tone it down a bit later in the season, but he had a more friendly demeanor throughout the season, which is a bit funny considering once his character is solidified in later seasons, he's established as even more stern than he was in Season 1. However, the way they were obvious in trying to lighten the tone for Season 2 because fans complained that the show was too dark for Star Trek reminds me a bit of another more recent Star Trek show, and when I see trailers for Discovery Season 2, I can't help but think of Deep Space Nine Season 2, but let's not get too much into that. And overall, Season 2, I would say, has a very strong start and a strong finish, but kind of dips a bit in quality in the middle. But that's true of a lot of TV shows nowadays. Anyways, let's get into the episode, starting with the premiere, Homecoming. So Deep Space Nine kicks off its second season with a three-parter. So right off the bat, it's really setting itself apart from other established Trek, as there's never been a three-parter in Trek up to this point. Now, I will cover each part separately, as I do think each part is distinct enough to cover on its own, but for the three-parter as a whole, which I personally refer to as the Circle Trilogy, I was very impressed with it. So having a strong religious-based isolationist movement that is suspicious of foreigners is something extremely relevant today, but I wouldn't really say that this episode predicted the future in that regard, but rather it's a recurring theme that occurs throughout history, and the show simply picked up on that. Also, we get what I think is the best guest star in the season with Frank Langella, I personally recognize from the movie Dave. He would later go on to get nominated for an Oscar for his role in Frost Nixon. Anyway, I think he really elevates this episode and once again plays a great villain, and just like those other two movies I mentioned, he plays a politician, something he's obviously really good at. Now, getting into Homecoming in particular, this episode mainly sets up Lee Nullis, which I think is a very interesting story, and I just think that the pacing in this episode really works. So we get a lot of scenes and action sequences that reinforce to the audience that this Lee Nahlas guy is a huge hero and can fix everything. And once we meet him, we find out he's just some dude who's sick of being called a hero because he's actually nothing special. And he recognizes that he's nothing special. Sure, he fought in the Resistance and he has skills as a fighter, but I think he sees himself as a nobody. And just like anyone else who fought in the Resistance. So it's an interesting turn, which I think is handled quite nicely by Sisko having to give him a pep talk that he has become a symbol for Bajor, like it or not. And if he really wants to do what's best for Bajor, he needs to allow people to see him as this symbol. So it's a great Sisko moment. So overall, I like this episode. So next episode is The Circle, the second in the trilogy, which is probably my favorite episode of the trilogy, as it does deal directly with the Circle. It begins with Major Kira getting reassigned by Richard Nixon and Lee Nahlas filling her post. I do like how much they established that Sisko and Kira have grown to appreciate and respect one another to the point where Sisko fights to get Kira back. Plus, we get one of my favorite character scenes of the entire show, that after it's announced Kira has been reassigned, Odo argues with her that she should fight it, and one by one main characters enter her room to wish her farewell, until it becomes a comedic cacophony of chaos. And the comedic timing in the scene is just simply beautiful. I love in particular where Quark comes in and he sees all the people and he just shouts, "A party!" That was a great moment. I have to say I wasn't as big of a fan of the foreshadowing of Burrell and Kira's romance, but it's not that big of a deal in this episode. And the rest of the episode has some well-crafted suspense as well, such as Odo sneaking on board the Corsari ship to discover that the Cardassians are the ones supplying the weapons to the Circle. And the rescue mission for Kira was exciting as well, but it was most of all, it was the suspenseful ending where Sisko informs Starfleet about the Cardassians, but the Admiral still orders Sisko to withdraw regardless, but you see that Sisko refuses to do so, and it is very suspenseful. So even though Deep Space Nine would get better in later seasons, the three-parter, to me, personifies Deep Space Nine in the first two seasons as its best moment. Again, except Duet, but that was more of an exception. Whereas this trilogy seems to represent everything the first two seasons were about, so another great episode. So next we get to the final episode of the trilogy, The Siege, and I'll be honest, it's probably my least favorite of the trilogy. Don't get me wrong, I still like it a lot. I think it's of the same high quality of the other two episodes, but I thought the payoff didn't quite live up to the setup. But as I said, it was still good. I do think that they spend a bit too long on the evacuation, everyone saying goodbye to one another, and the side plot of Quark overbooking the runabouts, while funny, wasn't really entirely necessary. And I feel this time could have been better spent focusing more on the main plot, which seemed to be resolved somewhat easily. But that being said, still a lot of great scenes in this episode, such as the team up with Jetsi and Kira going on a quest to give the evidence to Cardassian that the Cardassians are funding the Circle's movement. As before, we got a lot of great dynamic with Kira and O'Brien, and in this episode we get some good Jadzia and Kira moments, and these interactions work even better as it plays off of Kira coming from more humble beginnings and her teasing Dax about being too dependent on gadgets and gizmos, and I love that. As too often in Deep Space Nine, Kira can come off as just another Starfleet type who just happens to be wearing a different uniform, but this showcases the difference between her and Starfleet in great ways. And also the storyline with the Bajorans trying to take over the station and Sisko depending on Lee Nahlas to solve this resolution was also really good. So it was a satisfying conclusion to this great trilogy, but perhaps not as satisfying as it could have been. So next episode is Invasive Procedures, and to be honest, when I first saw this episode, I loved it, but later would not think of it as highly, but watching it again recently, I loved it, and I do think my initial reaction to this episode was correct. The one issue I had with it, which I'll just go ahead and get it out of the way, is this episode was very poorly placed, being the episode that follows the siege, because in that episode, the station had to be evacuated, save for essential personnel, and this episode begins with the station having been evacuated save for essential personnel, so it's very repetitive. The simple fix would have just been to show this episode later in the season, but oh well. Other than that, I thought this episode was pretty good. It was really suspenseful as it jumps right into the storyline of the station being taken over and the crew being held hostage. And the emotional stakes were really high as Jadzia's life hanged in the balance. There were some great emotional scenes, such as the scene where after Jadzia had the symbiont removed, Bashir made a promise that he wouldn't let her die, and that was really emotional, really well acted scene that brings a tear to my eye every time. It's a great Bashir moment. But what's best about this episode is Sisko. There were so many badass Sisko moments in this episode that I literally cheered on this recent rewatch, whether it be a fist pump or outright applause. The standout Sisko moments for me is after Varad joins with Dax and Sisko reminisces with him and tries to convince him to save Jadzia, and when he refuses, he suddenly just slaps his hands away and says, "Our friendship is over!" I love that. And also, when he was trying to convince Varad's girlfriend that he's changed and that he's going to leave her, and then Varada acts all distant with her, and she can tell that something is wrong, and Sisko gives her the most awesome "I told you so" look that literally had me clapping and hooping and jumping up in the air as it was so great. And of course, the best Sisko moment, which may be one of his best moments of the entire show, was of course in the end, where Varad assumed Sisko wouldn't shoot him because it would risk damaging the symbiont, and he says, "Goodbye, Benjamin," but Sisko calls out to him and says, "Don't call me Benjamin," and then shoots him. Awesome one-liner, I love it. And Quark's storyline in this episode was interesting too, as he betrays the crew and then is betrayed by the Klingon Yeto in a very interesting scene where he calls him a stupid Ferengi, which was a pretty funny scene. But Quark redeems himself by single-handedly being responsible for saving the day. That is right. Quark saves the day. Like, I heard some people question how people could forgive Quark for betraying them in the first place, but I think they forget that he is the one who saves the day, because he throws a successful ruse to get himself into sickbay, where he clues Bashir into a plot to knock Yeto out by distracting him by pretending to be in pain. Another great scene, by the way. And as soon as Yeto is knocked out, Quark stops screaming and says, "Thank you, Doctor. I feel better already." And then Quark is able to free Odo, who Odo is able to unlock Varad's ship and stops them from leaving and pretty much saves the day. And this is all because of Quark, and he was successful at ruse. Anyways, I wouldn't by any means say this is one of the best episodes of the show, as it does have some flaws, and it doesn't really have any deep themes or meanings, but it's still a fun episode to watch that I thoroughly enjoy. So next episode is Cardassians, and this isn't by any means a great episode. In fact, I recall when I first saw it being particularly unimpressed by it. It is really interesting in retrospect, as it's the first reappearance of Garrick, a character who would go on to be considered by many, including myself, as the best character in the series and one of the best in the entire franchise. And he was originally only intended to appear in that one episode in season 1, so this is the episode that really establishes him as a recurring character. And I do have to say, his scenes and interactions with Bashir were golden and really sets the stage for where the relationship will go. Also, this episode really establishes Gul Dukat as a staple for the series as well, and I do really enjoy the political intrigue element of the episode, such as Bashir uncovering Gul Dukat's plot with Garrick's help, of course. That was a great scene. I just wasn't that on board with the whole storyline of the Cardassian orphans being raised by Bajorans to hate Cardassians Cardassian. It's an interesting concept, but I don't think they go anywhere with it, nor do they really justify the storyline's existence. I particularly disagreed with Sisko's ultimate decision to give the Cardassian boy back to his biological father. In fact, I wouldn't be too surprised if the boy committed suicide once he got back to Cardassia, as he's obviously very much doesn't want to go. I would even go as far as to call this decision irresponsible of Sisko. So all in all, it was a pretty good episode, but nothing special. So next episode is Melora, and what can I say? This is a throwaway Romance of the Week episode that's not very good. It's centered around a character who was originally supposed to be a main cast member, but apparently the producers realized it would cost too much money to do low-gravity scenes all the time, so she was replaced by Jadzia Dax. But when this episode came out, I was like, oh, that's where that character is. And honestly, I think she would have worked much better as a main character than she did as a one-off, because you can tell they had a lot of backstory plotted out for her, and they tried to cram it all in this one episode, and it simply did not work. And I simply didn't buy Melora and thought she was an annoying character. She was in fact being extremely obtuse, as Sisko and Dax clearly weren't treating her any differently because of her disability, and would in fact treat any ensign the same exact way, but she was being completely unreasonable by constantly insisting otherwise. And her romance with Bashir was kind of boring. Didn't really interest me. I mean, I do buy it, I just don't care about it. And the side plot in this episode was really dumb as well, featuring a two-dimensional character who wants to kill Quark. But what's worse is how he all of a sudden goes from wanting to kill Quark to running around the station, killing random people, and hijacking a runabout. They just really didn't establish him as that type of character who would do that, but hey, the plot required it. So overall, this is not at all a good episode. So next episode is Rules of Acquisition, which is the second appearance of Grand Nagus Zek, so in many ways could be seen as the second full-blown Ferengi episode, and it wasn't too bad, as this episode was an homage to the 12th Night, and although I wouldn't call this episode fantastic, it's certainly a way better episode than when Deep Space Nine tries to do another Ferengi-centered cross-dressing episode. But I'll get to that and later in due time. As far as this episode goes, it's decent. Unlike a lot of bad Ferengi episodes, it doesn't do over-the-top silly humor, and in fact has a pretty interesting, straightforward plot of a Ferengi female seeking profit, but then falling in love with Quark. I thought Pel was a really well-rounded and interesting character, and her interactions with Quark were absolutely golden. My least favorite scenes of the episode have to be the Zek scenes where he keeps trying to feel Major Kira up. That doesn't make for pleasant viewing and isn't very funny. But this episode is the first time the Dominion are name dropped, as they would be name dropped 2 more times before they're introduced in the finale. The Dominion is name dropped by the Dosai, who are the painted red scary aliens that kick people's asses and sometimes kill them over negotiation, as they're said to be very serious about profit. I found this race to be a bit contrived, as it's obvious it was just a way to make Quark's negotiations more scary and difficult. At any rate, I found the humor between Rom, Quark, and Pel really worked in this episode, mainly because it was subtle and not too forced, so it was a decent episode. Not a great one, but not a bad one either. So next episode is Necessary Evil, and I did do a full-length review on this episode if you want to hear more of my thoughts on it, but basically, it was a really good episode. It gives us some wonderful glimpses into what life on the station was like during the Cardassian occupation and just how unpleasant it was. In flashbacks, we're treated to seeing Dukat hire Odo to become the station's chief of security, and we also see Odo meet Quark and Kira for the first time. While in present times, we get a real noir type episode where Quark is hired to find a mysterious list, but then his employer also hired an assassin to kill him in case he looked at the list, which he did. So while Odo investigates the attacks, this ties directly to the flashbacks of a murder case that he investigated where the same Bajoran woman who hired Quark and had her husband murdered. I love the look back into the past and the peek inside Odo's head. I wasn't as big into the noir elements as they felt a bit too hand-fisted, particularly Odo's log entries, which read a bit too much like stereotypical noir detective narration. And Odo was kind of portrayed as much smarter and more observant than he has been in other episodes or will be in the future. And the backstory with Kira felt a bit contrived as well, but still a great episode. I love, for example, the interactions with Rom, particularly how Sisko and Odo so effectively play the good cop, bad cop routine on him. And this episode does do a lot to establish Gul Dukat and the type of egotistical tyrant that he was. So it's a pretty good episode, just not one of the best. So next we get Second Sight. And so begins a slew of bland episodes in the middle seasons as we get a run of mediocre to bad episodes, starting with a particular bland and boring episode, Second Sight. Now, I have to admit, rewatching this episode, I found I actually liked it slightly better than I remember liking it. But that's not a high bar, as I remember it being terrible, or what I can remember of it, as it is a very forgettable episode, as most people don't even remember this episode existed, because it's incredibly bland, as it's about Sisko falling in love with a woman he sees for like 2 minutes at a time. In other words, it's a romance that is not all earned, and therefore not believable, and therefore not interesting, and therefore nobody cares about what happens to it. And that's what the whole episode is centered around, and therefore the episode doesn't work. The whole story about Sisko's love interest being a projection made by a bored housewife, blah blah blah, boring, technobabble, psychobabble, nonsense, whatever. But let me get to the logic of this episode. So let me get this logic of the episode straight. So the woman who married the terraformer is unhappy in her marriage, but her species bonds for life, so she can't leave him. But her unhappiness causes her to send out projections that could kill her. Okay, well the thing is the show doesn't really clarify on whether this bond for life thing is biological or cultural, because I think that's an important distinction to make. Because if it's cultural, then the culture is barbaric and bullshit, because if people who are unhappy in their marriage are at risk of dying, that's cruel and unusual to force them to stay together, because it actually puts their lives at risk. If it's biological, then that's poor biology, that they physically have to stay together but could die if they're unhappy. Jeez. Either way, it's dumb. Now, this episode did have some interesting aspects. Most particularly was the relationship between Sisko and Dax. They actually had some good moments in this episode. But overall, this episode is so bland, so uninteresting, unremarkable. Yeah, it's just not good. So, next in the series of bland episodes is Sanctuary. It's funny, whenever I think of Season 2, this is the episode that always first comes to mind. This episode to me most encapsulates what I think of Season 2. Bland, kind of interesting, but doesn't really live up to its full potential. And there's a lot of potential in this episode about refugees, where some strong commentary could have been made, and this could have explored the Bajoran people and their current situation more, and it could have explored Kira's character more, but it falls short of all of that, as I think the script doesn't quite realize its full potential, and it's actually really disjointed. First of all, the story doesn't work for an analogy for, say, Syrian refugees or the equivalent that was relevant when this episode was made, because in this case, Sisko has found a perfect place for these refugees to resettle, and is being very helpful to them, but the refugees are just being unreasonable and demanding to settle in Bajor for religious reasons, even though the Bajoran people are very correct to deny them, as Bajor can't support them, and they don't need to go to Bajor, because there's a very perfectly acceptable alternative, and these aliens are simply being unreasonable, so it doesn't work as an allegory for real-life refugees. And it doesn't work as a character study for Kira or the Bajorans because the refugees and Kira's friend is being completely unreasonable, so that fails too. And the episode has a lot of unnecessary scenes done in a lame attempt to create tension, such as the Nogs feud with the refugee kids and them running off and trying to land on Bajor but being destroyed. As I said, the whole script was poorly constructed. However, we do get our second name drop of the Dominion in this episode, as the screens say that their world was conquered by another alien race, but this established but the alien race that conquered them was then conquered by the Dominion, which is how they got free and became refugees. So this established the Dominion more as a conquering race, so that's interesting. Anyway, I wouldn't say it's a horrible episode, as there are some elements of good storytelling here, but it doesn't come together in a coherent story, therefore not a good episode either. So next episode we get is Rivals, and in contrast to Second Sight, rewatching this episode made me appreciate it even less and made me think it was actually a lot worse than I remember. I honestly don't see the point of this episode at all. It's not funny, it's not suspenseful, nor interesting, nor is it a good character piece. It's kind of just there. Sure, it may try to be funny, but it fails miserably and it's just silly. I mean, really, a machine that controls luck and some technobabble about neutrinos to explain it, please give me a fucking break. In fact, I would say this episode reminds me more of a first season episode in the worst way imaginable. It's a regression to bad storytelling. First off, the whole thing with the El-Orians being listeners, particularly how it's described in this episode, is ridiculous. Star Trek has always been accused of stereotyping alien cultures and reducing them to one characteristic, i.e. Klingons being warriors, Vulcans being illogical, but I think this is the worst case with the El-Orians being a race of listeners, and they hammer this point to an absurd amount in this episode. It's ridiculous, and the character introduction is rushed and sloppy, and I never cared about this character nor his feud with Quark. And what's worse is this character is supposed to be a master con artist, and yet that elderly woman talking about a mining prospect is so obviously conning him, and the fact that he couldn't see that makes him a colossal moron, and I completely don't buy him as a con artist. The one saving grace of this episode is the subplot with Bashir and O'Brien playing racquetball. That was actually kind of funny and cool and helps establish the relationship. I must say I did like how Bashir came off as an arrogant ass, being an expert in racquetball when O'Brien was just looking for a friendly game. So the racquetball subplot prevents this episode from being considered one of the worst of the entire show, but it's still a terrible, terrible episode. So next episode we get is The Alternate. Now, this isn't a terrible episode, as there are some good aspects to it, particularly meeting the scientist who quote-unquote raised Odo, who was mentioned before in Season 1. That was really cool, and I think the episode did a fantastic job of establishing the relationship between the two. In fact, in many ways, Odo comes off kind of like an angsty teenager in this episode, and believe it or not, I mean that as a positive thing, because it's an interesting dynamic that Odo doesn't think of Dr. Moore Pohl very kindly, but he does look upon Odo very kindly. And you get the impression that Odo thinks of him more like a torturer or just remembers all the pain that he caused. But I think buried underneath those feelings, Odo does realize that Moore was instrumental in his growth and does look upon him as a father figure, but he tries his hardest to deny it. Where Moore is quite open and honest with how he views Odo as a son, the son that he never had. And so the dynamic between those two positions is very fascinating to explore. So I do appreciate this episode strictly on a character dynamic aspect. However, the issue with the episode is with the plot, as the plot was centered around another fake out of them trying to discover Odo's origins, which really annoys me. And they find like a changeling type creature, but it turns out to be nothing. That bothered me. And then the plot of Odo actually being the monster attacking people because he was affected by some gas honestly was pretty dumb. So overall, I would say this episode is pretty bland episode. Some interesting aspects, but some dumb ones as well. So next episode is Armageddon Game, and this is another episode that I often forget exists, and I forgot what happened in this episode as well. I mean, I remember the main gist about a group of aliens with awful hairdos trying to kill O'Brien and Bashir because they want to erase all traces of a biological weapon after having just made peace. But beyond that, after rewatching it, I realized there's a reason why I don't remember this episode very much, because there's nothing really beyond that. The plot of this episode is bland and cliche and offers nothing new. The only thing keeping it from being absolutely terrible is the Bashir and O'Brien relationship, but even that doesn't work as well as the episode thinks it does, as the whole plot is obviously a contrived reason to put these two together and have them interact, and it doesn't really work. Plus, on top of that, being a cliche episode about two crew members having to bond where they're being trapped by aliens, is also a cliche episode about these characters are dead, where the audience know full well that the main characters aren't dead, but the other characters in the show think that they are dead until it's proved otherwise, a la episodes like The Most Toys, The Next Phase, and many others. So this cliche has been done dozens of times before in Trek, so that just makes the episode seem even more bland and uninspired. But as I said, not a terrible episode, because some of the interactions between O'Brien and Bashir works and it helps build the relationship, and some of the suspense story can work as well. But overall, it's just bland. So next, we finally break the monotony. We break the bland streak with a great episode, Whispers. I always loved this episode, and I always thought of it as an underrated episode, but recently I learned that this episode is actually polarizing, as there appears to be a sizable group of people that hate this episode, but there's also a sizable group of people who agree with me and love this episode, which is interesting. Speaking for myself, though, I think this episode is absolutely brilliant. As you follow O'Brien, as everyone around him starts behaving strangely, and it gets worse and worse until O'Brien has to flee the station and go into the Gamma Quadrant, as it appears everyone has turned against him. But the big reveal is that the character we've been following isn't in fact O'Brien, and is just a replica of him designed to assassinate some visiting aliens. And the reason why I think this episode works better is because of the context of Star Trek. Because watching this episode in that context, the viewer has certain expectations, such as when the crew start behaving strangely, one would assume it's a parallel universe, an alternate reality, or the crew has been infected by mind control aliens, or an alien virus, or all sorts of other Trek cliches that has appeared in Star Trek dozens of times. But this episode expertly subverts all of those expectations and instead makes it so the problem isn't with everyone else, it's with O'Brien himself. A very simple solution, and it makes so much more sense, and it's less, and a viewer of Star Trek is less likely to consider it. Now, I heard some people say that this episode is too slow or boring, as we get O'Brien's narration through his log entries and long scenes of him like eating dinner with Keiko or listening to personal logs. But I actually love that, as it slowly builds the tension and slowly establishes that something is kind of off. That's why I think this episode comes off kind of like a parallel universe episode, as it builds off the slight differences, kind of like the Next Generation episode Parallels did. And it really earns the audience connection to the O'Brien replicant and really puts you in his mindset, which was a brilliant decision. Now, I heard the opinion that perhaps the episode would have been better had we seen it from Sisko's perspective, and thus the audience would know all along that this O'Brien wasn't the real O'Brien. And boy howdy, I could not possibly disagree with that opinion more. If this episode did that, it would come off as a cliche, stereotypical TNG type episode that offers absolutely nothing new. I think getting the audience to identify with the O'Brien replicant was a stroke of brilliance and gives the episode a more uniquely Deep Space Nine feel, as does the ending, which I thought was uniquely dark in Deep Space Nine. In fact, I would say this is probably so far in the show the most unique Deep Space Nine episode yet. And I've heard some opinions that thought that the O'Brien replicant should have survived and not been killed at the end of the episode. And again, I could not disagree with those opinions more, as the ending was so powerful, so brilliant, as the actual O'Brien is forced to watch a copy of himself, who is just like him in every conceivable way, die right in front of his eyes, as he says, "Tell Keiko I love her." That was such a powerful moment, such a great, brilliant moment. Killing him leaves a poignant exclamation point that's just powerful, as this whole episode is just powerful. So, next episode is Paradise, and this is another polarizing episode, but unlike Whispers, I'm not going to take a firm stance on this one, because honestly, I don't really have strong feelings about this episode either way. I just think of it as kind of bland. And this has always been another forgettable episode for me. I mean, it's kind of interesting how O'Brien and Sisko get stranded on the world where technology doesn't work, with a group of colonists led by an eccentric woman who just so happens to have strong feelings against technology. So for most of the episode, I'm with it, as its pacing is pretty interesting as the conflict between Alexis and Sisko slowly builds. And I love how when Alexis puts Sisko in the punishment box for trying to find a way off the planet, he refuses to capitulate to her even one little bit. But I do get the counter argument that Alexis is too annoying of a character to enjoy this episode. And Alexis doesn't really get her comeuppance, at least not enough for it to be satisfying, because she's a contemptible character, and although she does go to prison at the end of the episode, her philosophies are kind of vindicated when the rest of the colony stands up for her, and I could see how some would consider that ending very frustrating and ruining the whole episode. I mean, I guess it makes some sense that the colonists would be suffering from Stockholm Syndrome, having lived with her for over a decade or however long it was. But the thing is, the episode doesn't really play it off as Stockholm Syndrome, and plays it off more as, oh, there's some merit to her actions. And it doesn't have anything to do with her anti-technology philosophy, because that isn't really the point. The point is that she deceived a group of people by forcing them to crash on a planet and lying to them and allowing many of them to die when she had access to medicine that could have saved them. That's the point. And this episode seems to forget that point, because if it was simply about her anti-technology philosophy, then she could have asked for volunteers who wanted to live in that type of society instead of tricking people to do it. But I do enjoy seeing Sisko stand up to that mad woman and being willing to sacrifice himself to make a point, while O'Brien is a badass and is able to uncover her lies. So I do like aspects of this episode, but ultimately the ending does fail. So while it's not a terrible episode, it's not a good one. So next episode is Shadowplay, and I recently reviewed the direct ripoff of this episode, the Enterprise episode Oasis, where they just duplicated what was done here. And you know what? I realized after watching that crappy Enterprise ripoff that it actually makes me appreciate this original more. And there are many things about this episode that work, such as focusing on Odo and Dax and their interactions. It was an interesting pairing, and also seeing Odo bond with the young girl Talia. Usually when Trek has an adult figure, one maybe unfamiliar with human relations like Spock or Data, bond with a child, it's dreadfully boring and cliche, but it actually works here. It doesn't come off as cheesy at all. You actually buy Odo's interactions with her. I particularly like how she keeps asking him to shapeshift for her, but he doesn't because he hates shapeshifting for people's amusement. But by the end, he does shift into a spinning little thingy, which she loves and applauds. That was a touching moment. I actually really liked that, and I thought it was well earned. And if you didn't catch my reference to Oasis earlier, in that episode it's revealed everyone on the planet is actually a hologram, save for an old man who created it after all of his companions died, and it's the exact same thing here. But unlike Oasis, I thought that the reveal of this was actually good, and so we got our third name drop of the Dominion in this episode, where the old man reveals his world was conquered by the Dominion, and it wasn't the same after, which was what motivated him to move to this world and recreate everyone he loved as holograms. It's an interesting concept. Also, we get the second name drop of the Changelings, which was first dropped in the first season, which established that it's common lore in the Gamma Quadrant of a race of shapeshifters known as changelings that no one has seen in recent years, so they're considered to be a myth. In fact, it's even implied here that there are tons of fables about changelings throughout the Gamma Quadrant. Most of them pertain to them being hunted or persecuted, or portrays them as evil to further the fear around changelings, which does in fact fit nicely with what we actually learn about them, so it was a very good setup. That being said, I wouldn't say this episode is groundbreaking, as it can be a bit bland, and I didn't really care for the B plot about Kira getting with Bareil. That felt kind of forced and contrived, and the C plot with Jake saying that he doesn't want to go to Starfleet. I mean, fine, okay, whatever. But I still think it was a pretty good episode. So next episode is Playing God, and okay. So I remember seeing the promo for this episode the week before it came out. I thought it looked fascinating. It was all about a proto-universe. I thought that was an interesting concept. And I thought we'd get something like we'd later get with like The Simpsons or Futurama, where they interact with the microscopic universe and we get a lot of interesting moral dilemmas that Trek is so good at doing and fascinating sci-fi scenarios. But no, it was just a nonsense technobabble B-plot for an episode about a dorky Trill initiate being tutored by Dax. What a letdown. First off, let me say that this is the episode that completely rewrites Jadzia Dax's character, as in Season 1 she was portrayed as a wise and reserved character, which would actually make a lot more sense for a joined Trill who apparently has lived for centuries, but here she's portrayed as an eccentric ruffian who breaks all the rules and just doesn't fit in. Not to mention that the Trill initiate himself was dull and boring, and the plot that they tried to execute with him just doesn't work at all, as I didn't really buy that Jadzia saw something in him worth saving because he wasn't not really fleshed out. And the whole conclusion where he and Jadzia had to fly into the proto-universe, into the wormhole, where it was all of a sudden magically better, was really contrived. However, I will say the one saving grace of this episode is the plot about the Cardassian Vols. I love the Cardassian Vols. It was such an interesting design. And the plot with the Vols getting into everything was just so funny. I like how O'Brien contacted the Cardassians for advice on how to deal with the Vols, and the Cardassian was just being a dick to him. It was like, oh, well, if it's that big of an issue for you, you can just give us the station back. And how Sisko was like, once the Vols started chewing up the equipment, he's like, no more Mr. Nice Guy, put those phasers off stun. It was just a great Sisko moment. And most of all was when O'Brien got an idea to drive the Vols out with a supersonic noise, and just at that moment Quark just happens to step onto ops, and then O'Brien turns on the supersonic noise and the Quark starts screaming at the top of his lungs. That was funny as hell, absolutely hilarious. And I wish we saw more of the Vols in the future. More Vols. The rest of the episode's crap though. Next episode is Profit and Loss. And while it's not nearly as bad as the certain 6th season episode with a very similar title, it's still not very good. I recently heard that this episode is basically just the plot of Casablanca, but seeing as how I've never seen that movie, I really couldn't say. But that would kind of explain why everyone is acting so out of character, particularly Quark. As this is the episode, Quark is in love with the Cardassian revolutionary and Garrick is ordered to kill her, while Quark tries to win her over and Sisko's ordered to arrest her because the Cardassians bribed the Bajorans by releasing prisoners and blah 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 blah. I mean, this isn't the worst episode ever, but some of the dialogue and the romance scenes are Attack of the Clones cringeworthy bad. And although I always loved me some Garrick, I didn't think this was a particularly good use of him. It doesn't really fit with how he'll be portrayed in the future. And overall, I just thought Quark was too ridiculously out of character. So, a bland episode. So, next episode is Blood Oath, and while I wouldn't say this is a great episode, I would say this is the start of the end swing of episodes that were actually quite good and an improvement over that little slump in the middle. I do think this episode is a tad bit overrated as it relies on the gimmick of having 3 Klingon characters who appeared as an adversary to Kirk in the original series, and some people simply like the fact that it focuses on the Klingons, which is the first Deep Space Nine episode to do so. And I do think it was cool seeing these Klingons and their interactions with the Deep Space Nine crew, but a majority of the episode was just Dax trying to convince them to let her join them on their quest to kill the albino. I didn't really buy her friendship with them, and I didn't buy that she'd want to go so badly, and was never interested in their quest in the first place, as the albino himself was never fleshed out, and the story with them trying to kill him held no real interest. Plus, it was a tad silly seeing 3 old Klingons fight off like 40 men, but as I said, I like the interactions between Dax and the Klingons, so it's not a bad episode. It was okay. So next we get into the 2-part episode, The Maquis, and I will judge both parts at the same time. Now, when Season 2 first came out, they seemed to champion this 2-parter as the grand achievement of the show. I remember watching a special on TV about all the significant sci-fi TV shows of all time, and when they got to Deep Space Nine, they focused entirely on this 2-parter. Now, granted, it was before Season 3 came out, but still. Duet? Hello. Anyway, I do find even now some tend to highlight this 2-parter as the high point of Season 2. While I do like this 2-parter and wouldn't say it's bad by any means, I personally disagree with such sentiments, and in fact, such sentiments would lead me to the conclusion that this 2-parter is in fact overrated. Now, I do think it's interesting and asks a lot of tough questions, but the action and suspense aspects of it come off as bland. For example, the rescue of Dukat seems like a pale reenactment of the rescue of Kira in The Circle, which was much better. And the runabout fight at the end was just silly, and more to the point, I don't buy the premise that the Maquis would be this bad as freedom fighters simply because they're Federation citizens. Because Federation citizens do have a lot of skills, and colonists used to living out in the frontier would be a lot more hardened and used to dealing with hostile elements than, say, someone who lived on Earth their entire life. In addition, the Maquis being, helped and includes members of Starfleet who have Starfleet training. We even see in this episode with Commander Hudson. Not to mention, the point is driven home later with people like Rolaren and Chakotay. So I don't buy that the Maquis would be this bad and this ineffective. So those are my issues with the episode and why I don't think it's great. But I still do ultimately enjoy this 2-parter, as there are a lot of positives I do really enjoy, particularly the interactions between Sisko and Dukat, which are golden. Also, I do like the moral questions raised by the nature of Maquis and how Sisko can recognize that Starfleet isn't being realistic about what's actually going on in the demilitarized zone, and I like that. And I also like the scenes where he's yelling at Kira after dealing with Starfleet's dumbassery. Those were great. However, I wouldn't say this is the best episode that dealt with that aspect of the Maquis. For that, I would actually turn to a Next Generation episode, believe it or not. The penultimate Next Generation episode, Preemptive Strike, which actually aired after this episode did, that dealt with Rolaren's defection to the Maquis. That episode, I think, painted a clearer picture of what it would actually be like to live in one of these colonies, and a clearer picture on how justified the Maquis truly were. So frankly, I thought Preemptive Strike did this episode better. And this 2-parter is good, but nothing to write home about. So, next episode is an episode I think does live up to the hype that it gets, and that is The Wire. Although I do think very highly of The Wire, now when this episode first came out, I didn't think as highly of it and kind of just dismissed it as an average episode. Part of that could be, in retrospect, I now know what an amazing character Garak is and will become, as he will in fact become my favorite character of the entire show. And looking back on it, one can tell that this is where the show writers start to truly realize his full potential, and from here on out he will become a staple of the show. But I think there's more to it than that. As when I first saw this episode, I was oversaturated with the cliche of having a medical emergency episode where a main character's life hangs in the balance and it's all about the doctor trying to save him. Kind of like episodes like Shades of Grey, Ethics, and The Dark Page. So I think I kind of dismissed it as one of those cliches without giving it a chance, because upon further examinations, it's actually much more than that. Although it is like that on the surface, underneath that surface, it's a major step forward in Bashir's character development, world building with the Cardassians. As this episode, the concept of the Obsidian Order is first introduced, and turning Garak from just another recurring character to a fascinating, dynamic character that people will grow to love. And there are some amazing performances from Alexander Siddig and Andrew Robinson in this episode, as Bashir struggles to save his life and Garak's dependence on a pleasure-giving device that was never meant to be used long-term, and thus breaking down causes him to go manic, which leads to a lot of golden acting opportunities that Andrew Robinson takes full advantage of and really shows off his acting chops as he plays Garak upset, Garak drunk, Garak enraged, Garak full of sympathy, Garak full of sorrow, and then just back to plain simple Garak. The acting range Andrew Robinson does in this episode is simply amazing, and the whole episode could have very easily fallen apart in the hands of a lesser actor. And on top of that, we get the introduction of Anabra Tain, which was handled so well. It's no wonder that they bring him back for more appearances, as his appearance here was extremely effectively creepy, as he seems to know everything about Bashir down to what he likes to drink and how he takes his drink. So an absolutely brilliant episode. So after that, we get Crossover, which is the first follow-up to Mirror Mirror, where we revisit the Mirror Universe for the first time since the original series, and the manner we do so is totally different than what anyone expected. Up to this point, Deep Space Nine had made a point of blazing its own trail and not relying too much on previous Star Trek series that came before it, but I think what they did here is still incredibly unique to Deep Space Nine. To say this episode subverts expectations, I think is a vast understatement. Everyone had expected the sequel to Mirror Mirror to be like Mirror Mirror, where characters we know and love meet their evil counterparts. In fact, there was a Next Generation novel about this where we see the evil versions of the Enterprise D crew. But this episode does something entirely different and carries on from the ending of Mirror Mirror to show at the ending of the episode where Kirk convinces Mirror Spock to make change in the universe to try to undo the evil empire actually backfires, as it allows an alliance from their former victims of the Empire, namely the Klingons and Cardassians, to rise up in an alliance that enslaves the human race. That was really unexpected and richly dark. Also, we get something that we didn't get in Mirror Mirror, and that is our heroes meeting their own counterparts, as the scenes with Kira and her counterpart together were freaking brilliant. And it's a great character journey for her as she meets her counterpart, who's basically just like Gul Dukat, her worst enemy, a tyrant who runs a station that oversees the enslavement, torture, and genocide of an entire race of people. And her going to face with that is amazing. Also, this episode keeps the same style of Mirror Mirror that made that episode so great, of having it be super tense, a very suspenseful tale of main characters trapped in a nightmare that there seems to be no escape from. In fact, I even go as far to say that this episode does a better job. And of course, a big strength of this episode is Avery Brooks, and his over-the-top acting in this episode is absolutely amazing, as he plays his Mirror Universe counterpart. And if there's anything Avery Brooks is good at, is over-the-top acting. I don't care about ore processing. Fix my engines. Well, now, that's more creative than he usually gets. And of course, there's the very classic, Smiley. I don't like Miles, that's why I call you Smiley. You got to love that. Also, Nana Visitor is great in this episode, playing the two different versions of Kira, and she also has an absolute blast playing the intendant as well. And so I'd actually go as far as to say this is the second best Mirror Universe episode behind Mirror Mirror, and none of the other future Deep Space Nine Mirror Universe episodes, or even other series that do Mirror Universe, none of those actually managed to capture what this episode did. So overall, a really good episode. So, next episode is The Collaborator, and this I think is a pretty interesting Bajoran episode, as it does ask a lot of tough moral questions and doesn't really give any clear answers and lets the audience ponder them, which is always a good thing to do. First off, there's the introduction of the character Secretary Kubis, whom you can almost sympathize with, as he's left with the choice: support the Cardassian decisions in all matter, even when they're sentencing innocent people to death, or die. Now, people like Kira will say it's not a difficult decision to make. The correct answer is to die. But that's easy for people like Kira to say from her perspective, because she's been fighting all her life. She's used to fighting. Giving her life for the Bajoran people is something ingrained in her. Not everyone is built that way, and if one person does choose to die, well, the Cardassians would simply just find someone else, and eventually they would find someone who's not willing to die. However, I will say, I thought that Odo was being a gigantic hypocrite for arresting Kubis and treating him like shit because he worked for the Cardassians. Hey, Odo, you worked for the Cardassians! I know, it's different. Odo didn't sign his name with the death warrants of thousands, but still, he worked for the Cardassians. So no way has his hands stayed completely clean, something that will in fact be covered later in the show. So I find his high horse that he takes here to be really fake, and he needs to get off it and over himself. And the actual plot of Kira being put in the position of investigating the accusation that Bareil is a collaborator, only to find that there's actually merit to it, which ruins his career, to be a very powerful plot. Not only does it create a rift between her lover, but also trying to do what's best for Bajor. But does she really? I mean, even if this charge was correct, is having Wynn be the Kai better than having Bareil be the Kai? Clearly the answer is no. So arguably what she does here ultimately hurts Bajor, and I like that irony. I think it's fascinating storytelling. And of course we get the twist that it wasn't Bareil who informed on a group of resistance fighters, including Kaiopaka's son, that got them all killed. It was Kaiopaka herself. And she did it to save thousands of Bajoran's civilians that the Cardassians were threatening to kill unless they found those resistance fighters. So the revered celebrity, celebrated religious figure actually turns out to do something that's considered treason. But again, is it? Her actions saved thousands of lives. So these are hard questions that are bound to come up in situations like the Bajoran occupation. I love that this episode is asking them. So it's a pretty good episode. So next episode is Tribunal, where O'Brien is accused of supplying the Maquis with weapons, and he's put on trial on Cardassia. Now this episode is a direct takeoff of the episode in the Maquis. Dukat described how the Cardassian legal system works, specifically that the verdict is determined before the trial, and the trial is just there to reinforce that the verdict is correct, which is an interesting concept to be sure, but I have some issues with its execution here, as what it effectively is not a trial, at least not what we think of a trial by our standards, be it modern time standards or in-universe standards of the Federation. It's basically a show. And they just put on a show to the public that this guy's guilty. And yet the episode keeps treating it like it's a trial with lawyers, and Odo keeps trying to object and enter in new evidence or whatnot things that you would do in a trial. But clearly, this isn't a trial. It's just a show. And it frustrates me how obtuse the characters are being over this fact. And this remains true throughout to the end of the episode, as they prove that it's just a show, and the only reason they were able to free O'Brien was by political maneuvering, as Sisko proved that they uncovered their plot and was in a position to expose it, so that's why they released O'Brien. So, to the end, the trial was not a trial, but a show. And yet, the lawyers here keep talking in terms of winning and losing. Like when O'Brien was set free, he was like, "Oh, I won. Oh no, they'll kill me." But in this show system, there's no such thing as winning, so they wouldn't even think of it in terms of winning and losing. It's very frustrating. That being said, there were some good aspects to this episode, particularly the first half when O'Brien was abducted from his runabout. That was very intense and scary. Anyway, this episode wasn't terrible, but it wasn't great, so it's fine, whatever. So finally, we come to the season finale, the Jem'hadar, which I do have a full-length review of if you want to hear more of my thoughts on it. But essentially, after name-dropping the Dominion all season, we finally meet them, and I have mixed feelings about the way they were introduced. In some ways, it's really effective, and in other ways, it's not. As you can kind of tell at this stage, they didn't really have a firm handle yet on what the Dominion were and who they were, and they were just trying to find their footing and figure things out. As many specifics and aspects and abilities shown here will be retconned later on, and they'll act like they never existed. For example, the Jem'hadar ship's ability to instantly shoot through Starfleet shields, or the Vorta's telekinetic abilities and such. But other abilities will stick and become staples of the Dominion, such as the Jem'hadar's ability to shroud, that is, render themselves invisible, and the long-range transporters capable of beaming across vast distances. And ultimately, I think they did do a great job of establishing the Dominion and the Jem'hadar in particular as a very serious threat, one that is really scary, but not too invincible or unstoppable has the way to be too overwhelming of a threat, but a threat that's way more serious than anything in the show so far. But getting into the episode specifically, it almost seemed like 2 episodes crammed into one, as the episode begins with a camping trip with Sisko taking Jake to a planet in the Gamma Quadrant for a camping trip, but then Nog and Quark end up tagging along, and this storyline comes off as a silly comedy, and to be fair, it's an effective one, as I found the scene where Quark accidentally lights himself on fire hilarious. However, once the Jem'hadar show up, it suddenly turns into a dark and intense suspense thriller. And frankly, I don't think these two tones blend well. It makes the episode feel very disjointed. To be clear, I think there are many examples of the show actually blending suspense and comedy well. This just is not one of them. It just seems like the first half it was comedy, and the second half is a thriller, and these tones don't really mesh at all. That being said, I thought this was a very effective cliffhanger when the Vorta is revealed to be a spy, and then she just simply beams away through their shields and says, "You have no idea what's begun here." And that statement is true in a meta sense as well, as the introduction of the Dominion will fundamentally change the entire nature of the show and change it for the better, because from here on out, the show starts to get really good. So a pretty good episode, just not a great one. So that is it for all the episodes of Season 2. So now it's time for me to name my favorite and least favorite episodes of the season. So we'll start with my least favorite episode, i.e. worst episode of Season 2. And for this, there were many contenders like Melora, Playing God, Profit and Loss, the Armageddon Game. But for me, this comes down to 2 episodes, one of which in a recent video I named my least favorite episode of Season 2. But after having just rewatched it recently, I have to change my mind. And that's Second Sight. This is not quite as bad as I remember it. It's still terrible, but I'm going to say it comes off as a close second to the actual worst episode of the season, which is Rivals, which is actually much worse than I remember. This hastily thrown together episode with a flat, unconvincing, uninteresting character, creating a rival for Quark, which nobody cares about, and a ridiculous technobabble nonsense plot is absolutely horrible. This is the kind of terrible writing that seemed to belong more in Season 1, and the rest of Season 2 had moved beyond this, and was much better than this, but this terrible episode is a throwback, making it the worst episode of Season 2. So moving on to my favorite episode of Season 2, that is the best episode of Season 2. A lot of contenders for this one too, like the Circle Trilogy, Invasive Procedures, Necessary Evil, The Wire, Crossover, and the Jem'hadar. But I have to give this one to Whispers, one of my favorite episodes of the entire show. Whispers, I think, is uniquely Deep Space Nine, as it really subverts all expectations Trek fans have and tells an entirely different kind of story, one which is extremely powerful and makes the audience completely rethink everything they thought they knew, which while powerfully affecting the characters involved in the show. This episode is a stroke of brilliance in my opinion, making it the best episode of Season 2. So, my rating for Star Trek Deep Space Nine Season 2 as a whole, out of 10, is going to be a 7, very good. It had a strong start and a strong finish, but kind of drags in the middle with a string of bad episodes. But still, overall, it's a vast improvement on Season 1, as the show seems to find its niche and what it's good at, and releases some of the best episodes of the entire show, like Whispers, Crossover, and The Wire, making Season 2 a pretty good season. So that's it for my review of Star Trek Deep Space Nine Season 2. I will be back in about a month for my review of Season 3. In the meantime, you can check out my channel for many other Star Trek reviews, as well as I do many more videos and other shows like Game of Thrones, The Expanse, Lost, and more, so be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. And thanks a lot for watching.